Whenever I get bored, I browse forums. It's just what I do. It's my guilty little pleasure. Doesn't matter if it's hunting or fishing related. You know, I'm always on there just trying to soak up as much knowledge as I can. There's this one forum that I'm on all the time, and it's geared specifically toward catfishing. Not the MTV show Catfishing, but catching catfish. And it seems like every day there's a new thread started. The title always reads something like, "Complete noob here. What fishing pole should I buy?" or "What reel should I buy?" Any beginner question you can think of, it gets asked repeatedly. So I thought it'd be a good idea to do a video going over the basic gear you need for getting started catching catfish. It doesn't matter if you're going after blues, channels, or flatheads. I'm going to try to recommend stuff that's a good middle ground. There are some more specialized gear out there for catching specific species of catfish, but I'm going to pretend, for the purpose of this video, that you're a complete noob, that you have absolutely zero gear. So let's get you geared up. Typically, the first question I see is, what brand of rod should I get? And personally, I don't think it matters if you're just starting out. That cheap combos you can get at Walmart will get you going. As you get more into it, you can upgrade to the more higher quality rods, but just get started. Buy whatever you can afford, and don't pay too much attention to what rod's better than the other. Obviously, if you can afford it, get the best rod you can, but like I said, you don't absolutely have to spend, you know, $60 to $100 on a rod to catch catfish. Regardless of what brand of fishing pole you get or how much it costs, one thing you do really need to consider is how long it is. Rod length is mostly personal preference. However, there are some key differences between, you know, the longer rods versus the shorter ones. The longer rods will allow you to cast farther. They give you better hook sets at long range, and they're a little more forgiving when you're fighting a catfish. The shorter ones, you get a little more power because, you know, it puts that force closer to the handle, and they're easier to deal with, you know, in tight quarters. Some of you, if you have to fish from a bank and there's a lot of trees around, you know the hassle of, you know, trying to walk through the woods with, you know, a 10-foot rod. It's the most frustrating thing. Everything gets hung up on all the branches, and then, you know, the branches snap back and hit you in the face. It's not fun. Another thing you need to consider is the action of the rod. I wouldn't go below a medium rod. That'd be the most sensitive I would go, and that would be mostly if you catch like channel catfish and smaller flatheads and blues. Not that you can't catch those big catfish with a medium action rod. You just got to be a little more careful of how much flex you're putting in that. Most choose the medium heavy to handle the weight of the sinkers and the pound test line you've got. Now that I've made it through talking about rods without making a dick joke, let's move on to reels. Now, the kind of reel you choose depends on the kind of rod you have. If you have a rod that's made for bait casting reels, you got to use a bait caster. Otherwise, you will probably use a spinning reel. Although you can use the push button ones. I don't know what you can call those. Haven't used one since I was like 8, but they're usually like Zebco brand or something like that. The main consideration for a reel is dependability. You have to have a reel that can stand up to, you know, a lot of the unique things with catfishing. You know, the gunk from using shad and just the heavy pound test line and mud and sand. And if you have a reel that's not very good, it's just going to fail on you really quick. So what is the big difference between, you know, a bait casting reel or, you know, a spinning reel? And again, it's kind of personal preference, just like everything is personal preference. However, there are benefits to both. Spinning reels are what most beginners use just because they're so simple to use and they're pretty cheap. Most of your combos that you get from Walmart or wherever come with spinning reels on them. Just make sure you get one that's got a large line capacity. Bait casting reels are the reel of choice for the serious catfishing angler, and the reason is, you know, they've got an enormous line capacity. They've got great cranking power to reel in those big catfish, and as long as you take care of them, they can last you a lifetime. The downside is they are pretty expensive. I think even like your entry-level ones are going to run you like $50. And there is a bit of a learning curve to them to avoid the headaches of a nasty bird's nest. Now we come to a controversial one. Braided line or mono? It seems like this topic gets argued a lot, especially on forums, and I don't really understand why. I guess when you're behind a keyboard, the people tend to like yell their opinions on a keyboard, and if you're talking to them in person, typically you get a more rational response out of them. But again, it's all just personal preference. If you like braided line, use braided line. If you like mono, use mono. It's not a big deal. However, that old saying about lines still applies, and that you should use the lightest line you can get away with using. It's not because catfish are line sensitive or anything. It's just that those heavier pound test lines can be a little difficult to deal with. That's why I use braided line. Just because you can use the heavier pound test without having to have all that line thickness and all the headaches that come with it, like line memory. You know, take 60-pound mono line and pull it off the spool, and it's just all curly queued up, and it's just a pain in the ass to deal with. Again, it's personal preference, but I prefer braided. Now, the best rod and reel and line you can buy doesn't mean a whole lot if you don't use the right hook. Circle hooks are the most popular hook for catching catfish for good reasons. They are strong, they come in many different sizes, and they work a little different than normal hooks. The most common mistake people make with circle hooks is they try to set the hook. They get little bites, and then they run up there and then they pull on that pole as hard as they can, like they're on tournament bass fishermen, and they're gonna just yank the fish right out of the water. All they do is pull the hook out of his mouth. It took me a long time to break the habit of trying to set circle hooks. I grew up catching crappie with my grandpa and my stepdad, and you use J hooks and you set the hook. But when I started fishing for catfish and using circle hooks, it was so hard to break the habit of you get a bite and then you want to set the hook, and I missed so many fish. I was the worst catfisherman ever. But I finally broke that habit, and now I'm catching a whole lot more catfish. So let the hook do the work for you. That's what it's designed for. What happens when a catfish bites onto a circle hook, let's say the hook's like this, right? And the catfish bites onto it, and then it wants to take it and run with it. And that action there turns that hook into the corner of its mouth. And as it increases that tension, that rod bends and flexes and sets that hook for you. If you yank that pole and before the hook has a chance to set where it needs to be, you're going to just pull that bait right out of that fish's mouth, and you're going to be as frustrated as I was for a long time. So just resist the urge, just let the hook do its thing. Next up is sinkers. I use no-roll sinkers pretty much all the time, but you have to consider what type of water you're fishing in when picking sinkers and weight. If you're fishing in a pond or a lake or something that doesn't have any current, pick a weight that gets you to the bottom quickly but doesn't overload your rod. 2 ounces work just fine for most situations. If I'm drift fishing, even in a pond or a lake, you don't really drift fish in a pond because it's too small, but if I'm in a lake drift fishing, I use 8-ounce line or 8-ounce sinkers, only because it helps keep your weight or keeps your bait straight down from your rod. If you use too light a line, as you're drifting, your line drifts up and you get tangled easily. Speaking of getting tangled up, you will lose sinkers. I mean, it's inevitable. So you need to, if you use nothing but 8 ounces all the time, you're going to burn through your wallet really quick. They get pretty expensive. I think 8 ounces last time I checked. I think they're almost like $2 a piece. And typically people don't fish with just one pole. So, I mean, you can go through a lot of sinkers in a single night, especially if you're fishing in a river or something like that with a lot of debris floating around, or drift fishing when, your lines are going to go over, a stump or a rock or something like that. The thing with sinkers is if you can find somebody locally who makes sinkers, or if you do it yourself or want to get into it, do that. That's going to save you a crap ton of money. I don't make my own sinkers just because, messing with lead and smelting that stuff makes me nervous. Call me a little pansy, whatever. But I pay somebody else to do it. So, and He makes all of his own sinkers, so I just throw some money at him, and he's more than happy to make mine for me. So other terminal tackle you might want to get is some barrel swivels or three-way swivels, depending on the kind of rigs you want to go with. Leader line, and maybe some cigar floats. Swivels are used to connect your main line to your leader line. Using a swivel instead of a knot does a couple things. First, it is a great sinker stop, and second, it helps reduce line twist. Swivels come in various different sizes, but what you need to remember is that the lower the number, the heavier and stronger the swivel. Typically, a 5/0 swivel is a good compromise. Leader line can get confusing with all the options there are out there, but all you need to know is that your leader line needs to be lighter than your main line, and it needs to be abrasion resistant. Fluorocarbon is ideal just because it disappears a little better and it is more abrasion resistant than monoline. However, it is pretty expensive. Monoline works just fine. You can get those steel leader lines, but unless you're trying to catch gar or something else with teeth, don't even waste your money. The last little bit of tackle you may want to keep in your tackle box are some cigar floats. You won't use them all the time, but I like to keep some because sometimes the fish aren't hanging too close to the bottom, or there's a lot of weeds or something in the bottom, and having that float kind of helps bring your bait up off the bottom, makes it a little more visible. So that's it. That is all the gear you need to get started fishing for all three species of catfish. You can get really far down in the weeds with what particular rod or what brand of reel to get, but if you're just starting out, I wouldn't concern myself with it. Once you get a little more into catfishing, you can slowly start upgrading your gear. Just remember that plenty of fish are caught on that Walmart special. If you got any more tips for getting a beginner set up catching catfish, leave those down in the comments below. And as always, outdoor ladies and gentlemen, stay informed.